So good evening and welcome. Tonight I'm delighted to welcome you here to the Drysdale Lecture, an annual lecture whose purpose and focus is missiology. So good evening to those in the room and those who are catching up with us on other platforms. In 1916, Scottish evangelist John Douglas Drysdale settled in Birkenhead and gathered around him a following which soon became known as Emmanuel Church in Claughton Road. His fervent preaching challenged young people to be trained in reaching out to the needs of people worldwide. Emmanuel Bible College began training missionaries on November the 11th, 1920, with a grand total of 3 students. In 1997, Emmanuel Bible College, Birkenhead, ceased operation and became an integral part of NTC. And in 2004, the Emmanuel Centre, a new library and classroom unit, was opened to mark that transition. The mission interests of EBC were carried at NTC first by the Emmanuel Centre for Mission Study, then the Centre for Evangelism and Church Development, led by Momentum UK, and currently the missional studies and practice at Nazarene Theological College are embedded in the overarching practical theology department and programme. The Drysdale Lecture began in 1998 and is designed to allow an opportunity for critical reflection on key areas in missiology. Tonight I am delighted to welcome for our 2023 Drysdale Lecture, Lord Elorm Donkor. It's a privilege for me to do this as a friend and a colleague and an acquaintance for several years now. So it's a personal honour to also welcome you here, Lord. Lord Elorm Donkor, PhD Manchester, is the national head of the Church of Pentecost-UK. He is the former principal of the Birmingham Christian College. Lord is a scholar practitioner whose research and teaching cuts across the fields of mission, practical theology, and theological ethics. He is the author of Christian Morality in Ghanaian Pentecostalism and co-editor of African Pentecostal Missions Maturing with Clifton Clarke, and several other book chapters and journal articles. He is a passionate preacher, and we had the privilege of hearing him today in our chapel, and also a conference speaker. He has just changed jobs in September, he told me, so he might say a little bit more about that. But he has moved to London as the national head, so congratulations on your appointment, and may God bless you in that role as you oversee the work here, particularly in the UK, and the churches and pastors that you have talked to us about. The title of Lord's paper is Virtuous Influence Towards a Missional Pastoral Theology for the Next Generation of African Diasporan Pentecostals in the UK. Lord will bring us his paper, and there will be then a short time for questions afterwards, following the paper, and then a time for coffee and refreshments together in the college cafe. So let's welcome Lord to give us his paper and make him feel at home among us.
Thank you very much for that hospitable introduction. And good evening to all of you. I'm not new to NTC. It's homecoming for me. And so this evening, I'm grateful for the invitation and for all that Trevor and others did to get me here. All the preparations and assistance you have given me, I'm very grateful. So this evening, well, you wanted me to say a bit about my new job. Yeah. I was principal of the Birmingham Christian College for almost 10 years. And then I got redeployed, we call it, redeployed from there to another role, and that is to be the national head of the Church of Pentecost in the UK. So we have 165 congregations across UK from Aberdeen to Southampton. And we have 41 ministers, we call them district ministers, and 2,218 lay ministers who work with us in the local congregations. So my role now is to see to the mission of the church, involving all these people in the UK. All right, enough of that. So this evening we want to talk about something that is very dear to my heart. Missions. And I want to start by saying that formally when you hear missions, you are thinking about somebody sent from the West to other parts of the world. So probably an European and American sent from this part of the world to the southern part, to people in the dark places. Then that changed a bit, and then we said, all right, now mission is people coming from the south to the west or to the north to do missions. So that also has been a conversation and discussions and dialogues over some time now. Now we are seeing another form of mission, which is what I'm trying to draw attention to. So mission generally will be in different, somebody sent into a different culture. Now we have mission in the same culture, and that is a little bit more different from what we are used to. And so the paper is entitled Virtuous Influence. I'll just introduce it, and then I'll take the steps to go through it. Okay. All right. So migration and religious dispersion have been bedfellows for many years, many years. And diaspora communities that emerge in the West as a result of immigration continue to grow and have become a major force in world missions around the world. Although there are studies done on the experiences of the young people, that's the children of the first generation migrants who settled in these places and formed the diasporas, although there has been some studies on them, the experiences of these young people largely is left undiscussed in the literature. Most of the studies that are available focus on the engagement and disengagement debate, how these young people are in church or they are not in church, why are they in church, why they are not in church. So there is huge lacuna to show how young people are committed to these churches or otherwise. There is a huge misunderstanding in the whole issue of disengagement or engagement. So this paper is a discussion of some of those issues that I have identified with second and third generation members of Pentecostal churches within the African diaspora communities. It will present a brief historical background of the formation of these diasporas and show how Pentecostal churches have developed within these communities to become a major force for mission and strong religious backbone for the communities. The paper argues that the bifurcation of mission and pastoral theology makes it difficult to prepare the second and third generation of African Pentecostals for future evangelization of the United Kingdom. I argue in this paper that if mission were to be conceptualized as virtuous influence, then pastoral theology would necessarily become an intrinsic part of the concept of mission or mission theology. Understanding African theology, African diaspora in the West. And as we all know, this word, fancy word, diaspora, is one of those Greek words, and it's pronounced diaspero. And all it means is spread abroad, spread abroad. It was initially used actually for the Jewish communities around the world. So following the Babylonian conquest of the Jews in the 6th century BC, that's 586 or 587, by King Nebuchadnezzar, the Jews have always been found in every part of the world. So though forced into exile, the Jews who wished to stay true to their roots, their enforced residence in Babylon provided an opportunity to construct and define their historical experience and to invent their tradition. Similarly, the overwhelming presence of Africans all over the world show that the experience of diaspora has become an African reality too, in which African identities and traditions are being invented and reinforced. The creation of the African diasporas around the world, especially in Western countries, has a long history of transcontinental migrations of African people. This can be categorized into 2 epochs, some say 4. And so there is the historical migrations and then the contemporary migrations, or what is known the new diasporas. Robin Cohen is one person who has worked consistently in the area of diasporas, and he categorized the formation of African diasporas according to the events that occasioned the diaspora. So he calls them 4 different diasporas, and he said the first one was victim diaspora, the second one was labor diaspora, imperial diaspora, and then the current one, or the contemporary one, is trade diaspora. This paper is only concerned with the new African diaspora in the United Kingdom. So contemporary African diaspora and understanding the contemporary African diaspora in the UK is necessary. It's necessary for appreciating the proposal that I am making for mission to be conceptualized as virtuous influence. The current era in the creation of African diasporas, known as the contemporary or labor or trade diaspora, happened in the later part of the 20th century, from the 1960s specifically, and it was intensified in the 80s and the 90s. So this recent formation of African diaspora has been attributed to some push and pull factors. And this was the time that people traveled themselves, so they made a decision they wanted to travel, but some of them were pushed, some of them were pulled. The pull factors. According to Flahhouse and Haas, the pull factors are the conditions in the West that attracted Africans to come and settle here. So this includes the perceptions that many people had about the West. Perceptions about good health, facilities, education, political freedom, and others. So these factors is usually based on a glamorized view of the developed world. So the idea that the life is greener in the West has been an important and enticing reason for many Africans to migrate out of their continent because the hardships were many at home. As it turns out to be, some of them would actually have been better off in their countries. There are some push factors too. So although they made the decision and make the trip themselves, some were actually pushed to do so. The issues of poverty, ethnic conflicts, civil wars, famine, drought, human rights abuses by military regimes, and political and religious persecution in some of these countries were the push factors. So these factors are believed to be partly caused by neoliberal, post-independent economic policies that were brought upon the continent by the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. So in the 80s and in the 90s, when most of the first generation of the UK African diaspora communities actually intensified, there was huge drought across the countries, both in the West and in the East. For example, in Ethiopia and in Ghana, where bushfires burnt down people's agricultural proceeds or products and livestock. That was the time that most people we call the first generation today in the UK actually moved to the UK. And people moved to escape these challenges, and they traveled abroad for better conditions. Of course, as they traveled, they also went with their immaterial cultures, especially the religion. And a lot of these people were Pentecostals from Africa, so they came down to the United Kingdom as Pentecostal Christians. There are major churches that have been formed as a reason of the moving with their religion. So we have churches such as I wouldn't be able to go through even a tenth of them. So let me just pick about 4. So we have the Redeemed Church of God, the Redeemed Christian Church of God, or RCCG, which I think is the biggest, I think. Then we have the Church of Pentecost. We have various apostolic churches from both Nigeria and Ghana. Then we have the KICC, led by Matthew Ashimolowo. We have the Winners Chapel, and many, many others. Babatunde is one of the prominent scholars within the Redeemed Christian Church of God. And he says that the Pentecostal churches in the diaspora the Pentecostal churches in the diaspora have their origins in Africa. And then when they got to the United Kingdom and were trying to be part of churches local, they found that the churches couldn't meet their needs. And so some of them called for ministers to be sent them from their churches back in Africa. But of course, some of them also, the Christians started new churches here. So for example, KICC didn't have any mother church in Africa. Ashimolowo started KICC here in London. The first generation's process of migration to Europe or United Kingdom took many forms. And these are important to know, because the issues we talk about regarding the misunderstanding between the second generation and the first generation many of them borders on the experience of the first generation, which the second generation don't have, and so they don't understand. So in all the difficulties that they had to go through, whatever was pushing them, it was their religion, their faith in Jesus Christ, that sustained them and made the journeys successful. And Adogame explains that some of them employed religious resources and rituals through the different stages of their immigration process. But that did not end their battle. While in Europe, another battle for survival began. So many of them, of course, would be undocumented migrants. They had to find ways to work and survive in the United Kingdom. And those processes all necessitated that they came together to pray. And sometimes if you read some of the accounts about the prayer points, what they were praying for, and you are a second generation, you will wonder why they will be praying for such things. But to them, that was the real life they were facing at the time, and they had to survive through those times. Once settled or somehow settled in the UK, the struggle with their new life, these Africans called home, and some of them started churches in the UK. Nigel Rooms makes an important point that the children of these migrants acculturate at a faster rate or faster pace than their parents because of the education they have in the UK. And therefore, if the host community is unable to work cross-culturally, they quickly lose the following generation in the prevailing cultures that are around them. This issue is what is staring at the face of many diasporan Christian communities in the UK. The children have grown in the churches. They are now the second and even the third generation of these migrants. Some of them have started going to university. Some of them finished university, settled in jobs, and started their own families. And at that point, it was becoming clearer that a lot of them were not engaged with church. Many of them, after university, they're not with parents anymore. And then even those who are engaged, the engagement is not as the parents or the first generation would want it to be. So there is clear indication that many of these young people have joined other churches to try to find out whether it's better there. And when they find out that actually it's almost the same, then they become casual Christians. So there is still a disconnect between the diaspora church and then the local Christian churches in which the diasporas are located. And Rooms again said that the indigenous population among the mainstream denominations face cultural dislocation from the rapidly changing scene that now surrounds them, and find it difficult to engage in a meaningful way with those who are other, in order to form a vibrant Christian community. They find it difficult. And the issues we are talking about concerning second generation, first generation, is not disconnected from the local Christian community in which these diaspora communities are located. So many Christians within these communities are engaged. It's not like everyone is gone. Many of them are engaged, and in fact, a lot of them are in mission as well. Some second generation young people are now pastors of churches. In our church, for example, we have about 4 young ministers whose parents came and they were born here. So some of the efforts that these churches are making is impressive. The Church of Pentecost, for example, has 5 young ministers who have started campus ministries around the UK. So 41 university campuses around the UK, these young people go there to register a mission post, and they register it as a religious society through which they intend to evangelize other people who haven't met Christ, who do not know Jesus. But because a lot of these are still disengaged from the church, in 2000, the year 2020, the leadership of my church, the Church of Pentecost, commissioned a team to look into this issue. It was at that point that I became personally involved and actually faced the realities in a way that I know them now. So the study looked at the North American churches in Canada and USA, and then 5 nations in Europe, including the United Kingdom. And I will skip to talk about some of the findings because of the time. So the research was looking mainly at why, how my second generation members experience the Church of Pentecost in Europe and North America. How might the second generation members' experiences in the church in Europe and North America cause them to disengage and probably leave the church altogether? What are the main disempowering experiences of young adults in the church and that affect their commitment to Jesus Christ? So we used data from 4 research that had already been done. And each of those work was just 1 year old when we started our study. The first one was a work that was done in the USA by a colleague, a deaconess actually of the church. Her name is Alison Norton. And she looked at different churches in the USA, studying particularly the second and the third generations in those places. So generally 20 years and above, up to, say, 35 years. And what she found out was that young people in their early 20s leave faith generally in the US. But the churches that she studied, the young people of the same age who, in general terms, would have left church, were still in church. So most young adult members continue in the faith within the church, albeit issues that bothered them. There were issues that bothered them. Another work was carried on in the UK here, also again by a colleague, Opokunyani Caleb. He studied how beliefs and practices of the first generation caused the second and third generation to leave church. Very interesting. So the Christian beliefs and practices of first generation is causing a problem for second and third generation. And that is what I meant when I was saying that earlier, when we are talking about mission, is from one culture against the other, and maybe the missionary doesn't understand this culture, and that is why that happened, that's why that happened. This, I'm talking about children who are in their parents' churches, who are struggling with their parents' understanding of Christ, and then the practices by which they worship God. Another important publication again called, or the title is Two Worlds at War. And this was published by Xelon Press in 2020. In this work also, still second generation and third generation members of African diasporan young people were surveyed and interviewed. So the youth claim that they are not in church because, or they are not interested in church because of the first generation. So all of them, both in the UK and in the USA, they think that there's something that there's some misunderstanding on their parents' side. The parents are not understanding them. The parents also say the young people do not want to listen. And young people, we are not talking about children, we are talking about university graduates here who love Jesus. They want to follow him. And actually, during those studies, when I had opportunity to speak to individuals, I realized that they do this in pain. It's not like they just want to leave church, but they say they're not coping. So cultural identity was found to be one of the important issues for young adults in the studies, all the 4 studies that we consulted. And then in our own interviews also, these were borne out. So rather than downplaying their parents' origin and ethnic identities in favor of assimilation to probably black Britishness or black Western identities, most of the next generation respondents expressed highly salient African ethno-national identities. This is where it became very complex. So they're not saying that we don't want to be African, we are ashamed of being African, that's why we don't want. No, that's not the point. So they still want to be African, but African in another way. And the parents think that that is not it. And this is affecting how mission is done in the community, especially when leaders begin to think about who is going to take over. How is this mission going to be sustainable? How is the evangelization of the United Kingdom that we claim God has sent us to come and do alongside the host communities, how is it going to be possible if the young people leave the church? So among the young people in the UK particularly, another subject came up, and that was about the Holy Spirit and evil spirits and the overemphasis of witchcraft, that they think the parents were overemphasizing the presence of evil spirits, which they don't think exists in the way the parents were talking about it. So these are African children, but they don't think what the parents hold to is the case, or maybe shouldn't be held in those ways. Okay. So the research also demonstrates how the Ghanaian orientation in the church limits full inclusion and belonging of the second generation members. For those members, the relationship between their ethnic and racial identity is so strongly linked with the church that they will want the church to re-examine its ways and reprioritize the second generation above their own needs. So first, although the next generation often enjoy the ability to express their Ghanaian identities through dance, songs, and other aspects of liturgical life, they also express dissatisfaction with the church culture, which, according to them, felt oppressive to them. And when you hear things like that as an adult African, I think I fall more in the first generation, maybe in the middle somewhere. It's very touching, because earlier it is the same first generation that said other people oppressed them, culturally oppressed them. Now the children are saying that culturally they are being oppressed. Very interesting things happening in missions that we need to pay close attention to and begin to think about the way we conceptualize mission in the first place. Another thing that is related to culture is the sermons, but I think I'll skip that and move forward. There is a recent book published by Michael Niebauer, and Michael Niebauer raises issues with the conceptualization of mission, the way we define mission. So he has a very strong critique, particularly on mission as Missio Dei, mission as dialogue, and others. And he thinks that once you conceptualize mission in those ways, you are limiting the representation of mission which the book of Acts gives us. And I will explain what he means by that. So he argued further that the field of missiology does not have the needed resources to deal with the inherent lack of the kind of conceptualization that current mission theology presents. And the problems he sees is that it brings distinctions, and it has issues with agency and also persuasion. He says these things happen because of the use of dogmatic and anthropological approaches that are used to define mission. He argues convincingly that such issues can only be addressed from the field of theological ethics, particularly by virtue theory. His proposal for the use of theological ethics is because this approach helps both in critiquing the lack of the concept you are dealing with and also shows the provision or the solutions that are available. So while the discipline of theological ethics has provided primary critics or criticism, it also provides tools for identifying and solving the issues. All right. So it is based on my conviction of how Niebuhr has persuaded me in his arguments that I was inspired to come up with this idea of virtuous influence. And my idea of virtuous influence is also inspired by Alasdair MacIntyre. And MacIntyre's treatment of how two traditions may be integrated offers an erudite diagnosis and useful remedies for the problem of rival traditions that can enhance existing anthropological models of missions. So I have looked at the issue of the second and third generation vis-a-vis the first generation, and I think that there are two traditions there that are not agreeing with each other. And so to ensure that there is a coherent understanding of mission that now translates to the second and third generations so they can carry on the work forever, the mission has to be reconceptualized, at least within these communities, if not broadly. MacIntyre affirms that a tradition may get to a point in its development when it fails to meet the moral demands of its adherents. Whenever a tradition fails to make progress in the moral inquiries of its adherents and to provide answers to the important questions that they ask, just as it is happening between these two traditions, he says, then the tradition itself have to acknowledge or recognize that there is epistemological crisis. And at that point, members of the tradition should recognize the incoherencies and the inconsistencies of the ideas they are using to guide their practice. Further, MacIntyre asserts that when this happens, there is a need for reinvention or invention of new theory or a discovery of new ideas, which must meet three criteria. So the first criteria is that the new conception should be able to solve the intractable issues within these two traditions. Then the second is that the new conception should be able to explain why the first conception failed or is considered insufficient in dealing with the questions that they have. The third is that the new conception should possess essential continuity. It should be able to help the traditions to progress with their own tradition, because the new invented tradition. So this is what I am doing with the idea of virtuous influence. All right. So McIntyre's argument that instead of regarding rival traditions as being mutually exclusive and incompatible ways of perceiving the world or something, we should regard them as providing perspectives. So they are just providing complementary perspectives, and then find a way of integrating them so that they can work together. And in my view, this is what we need for African Pentecostal diasporan churches with regards to first and second, third and second generations. In this approach, McIntyre proposes that the way Aquinas was able to bring Augustinian theology and Aristotelian scheme together is very plausible, a method for anyone who wants to bring two traditions together. And that is what I took up to do. So what is the definition, or what do I mean when I talk about virtuous influence? Okay, I can skip. So two things I seek to integrate in this whole idea is that pastoral theology and mission studies, which seem to be aiming at the same thing but from a different, seemingly unrelated spheres, should be brought together, and that when you define mission, in there must be the sense of the need of pastoral theology. So my argument is that a good understanding of mission for the second generation of diaspora Pentecostal community must necessarily incorporate pastoral theology as part of mission and explain mission in such a way that it is not complete without pastoral theology. And here again, Niebauer's proposal comes very handy. Niebauer states that ultimately Jesus Christ expects those who follow him become like him in their conduct. Being witnesses necessarily should be about character. The imprint of Jesus Christ is found on the activities of the believer. So, conceptualization of mission for diaspora Pentecostals should tie the two things of the proclamation of the proclamation of Jesus, the gathering of the people, and then the character of the people in such a way that in one sweep of conceptualization, people will find these three elements of pursuit. Virtuous influence or virtuous practices have maximum impact on people, leading them to want to follow Jesus and replicate the same character of Jesus in all their activities. So what this will mean in actual practice is that every effort, every strategy, every activity of mission is looked at from the perspective of the end. So what is all this about? If all this is about being like Christ, then how do we go about it? So first generation African diasporans will then be critiquing the beliefs that they have about the Holy Spirit, the type of prayers they pray that are issues for the second generation. They will be doing all this thing, critiquing it from that end, that what is all this about? The same thing will be happening with the young people as well. It must be highlighted that when the integration of mission and pastoral theology I propose is taken seriously, then African diaspora young people can understand the Christian life as an effort for virtuous influence. So all the time, everything you are doing as a believer is you are trying hard, you are making an effort by the grace of God through the power of the Holy Spirit to make a virtuous impact in the world. And of course, that virtuous impact is defined by the character of Jesus. This means a process of being formed in accordance with the character of Jesus through the active work of the Holy Spirit, which flows through one's response to missional activities in their lives. It's a process in which one is always mindful that every activity presents an opportunity to use the virtues that God has given for honing of one's character. Such character formation is enabled, informed, and directed by the Holy Spirit, but it's also possible only through faith in Jesus Christ. So, as I come to the end, I have just looked at the African Pentecostal diasporan community and the churches that have come and claim to be in mission in the UK. How the younger generation are disengaging from the work that parents have started and the issues that they have raised. And I've looked at these issues and I've looked at them as tradition emerging within a tradition, for which matter there must be a conscious intentional integration of the traditions. And the method I have chosen is virtue theory through Alistair McIntyre. Then I've also looked at this new generation's efforts that they are making and the pain that they always exhibit if they have to leave the church. It was realized that the main issue is cultural, where first generation and second generation do not agree on certain Christian beliefs to start with. To address this situation effectively, we looked at how Aquinas integrated two rival traditions. We didn't quite go deeper into that, but we cited it as an example by which joining two traditions is possible. And I'm just concluding by saying that these traditions we are talking about within the African Pentecostal churches could be there in other cultures as well. The gap in age alone is sufficient to create another culture. And you will see that even youth have cultures that are different from older people. And we need to look at this closely and intentionally work on them if we want to keep the young people with us to continue the mission of Jesus in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Well, there's some really fascinating things to kind of get your teeth into there and to ask about. And we're going to have some time for questions. And if you'd like to give a question through either of the formats we have, physical or if there are questions come in, anywhere outside, we can put them to Lord So first of all, thank you for bringing your paper, and thank you for stimulating us with some thoughts and perhaps lots of questions we'd like to ask. So as you're kind of thinking maybe about some questions you'd like to ask, I'm just going to kick off with one that I'll try and articulate pretty well. So I'm trying to think about what might be specifically African or specifically Pentecostal from obviously someone who's not really in either of those traditions. And I'm trying to ask myself, do I have these same issues with my lads? Because it's actually part of the growing process of maturity. In other words, these conflicts are inevitably sociologically, perhaps, or in family. Is there anything that you think is particularly unique that you want to draw attention to in your, perhaps your own study about that issue? Is it just beyond family and ages to not only the cultural issues you've talked about, but I'm just wondering what role is the normative tensions that take place generationally? But I also want to ask you, so what role does that play? And secondly, just a question about, I think about how the connection between what you're finding in African diaspora is not only working among your own denomination, but you hinted at this, just your last line there, this could be replicated in not only, I think you were saying, African, perhaps diaspora churches, but this could be a phenomena much wider. Is that what you're saying? So I'd like to hear about those two aspects, and then invite others to come and ask their questions just by coming to the mic or by raising it with me. I'm happy to relay your question. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That's a very important question you're asking there. So the first one is what specifically? When you look at this group that we are studying, you would think that they've grown up with their parents, and so even unconsciously, they should have imbibed the religious beliefs of parents before this age that we are talking about now. And so I didn't expect that there should be such sharp differences between them and then the parents. But once we started the study, I got to understand that the age gap between them alone, and then the knowledge base of the younger people and then the older people are not the same. The scientific development of our time, our current time, is unlike their parents. So the way they rationalize things are completely different from their parents. So that alone, because specifically speaking, when I took the issue of the Holy Spirit, when a young lady was very passionate about that, that the way they are using the Holy Spirit shouldn't be used in that way. Because she is just sticking to what she reads and how she thinks the Bible shows the Holy Spirit. But of course, the parent who also knows that the Holy Spirit is God and he can deal with every issue, there is no issue beyond the Holy Spirit. So, so once that is stretched, then the younger person is thinking that no, that this doesn't fit in. And that can happen in other cultures as well. When you hold directly, strictly to a particular view, and then because of newer understanding that the younger people have, they think that no, this quite doesn't fit. It can happen in other places as well. This is what is happening in this group.
So thank you for that. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask, Lord? David, would you like to come to the microphone?
Let's just see if I understood this correctly, Lord. So moving from the tradition, first generation, through second and third, in a continuity towards influence and character. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Good, where you were talking about virtue, influence, virtue, ethics, and so on. Now, that influence and character, I could see that's an interesting way of thinking about it. It's letting go of the tradition and how that is handled, because, of course, first generation come with a deeply embedded tradition. Would you say that was a conservatively formed tradition, perhaps, in some way? Whereas with your second and third generation, they're less conservative, more mixed with the society, more liberal, perhaps, in the way they're thinking. So I'd like to know, what's the pushback from the tradition? And how deep is the pull towards formation and character building, which is quite an intriguing way. I don't know if I've made that clear. Is there a constant tension going on?
Yes, definitely, there is a tension. So my proposal is that whatever tradition you hold to, whatever position you hold to, you have to critique that from the end. What is all this about? What we are doing, what are we hoping to achieve with this? And what you are also saying that you don't understand what you are holding up to, what are you hoping to achieve? So the whole thing we want to achieve is that character of Jesus. If that is placed clearly in front of all of us, then we can look at the different beliefs and the challenges we have, and then bring ourselves together and say, oh, actually, this is unnecessary. This is too intrusive. This is that. And that this can take us there. Then also there will be hospitality between us. So there are certain things I will say, well, that doesn't really matter, so long as we are able to achieve this end goal of the glory of God, that is the character of Jesus. So that is the way I'm looking at it. It will trump a lot of the issues we have between us, among ourselves. Because each one of us think that what we are doing is the orthodox teaching, whatever that means, but that orthodox teaching should be arriving at a goal. So if that goal is what we are all looking at, then isn't there any other way for us to reach that goal? If there is, why should we fight among ourselves? That's the way I'm trying to think about this.
Jordan, have you got a question you could bring that you've either perhaps received or want to ask?
Yes, I've got a question for you, Lord, from one of our Facebook Live listeners. This is Joshua Toper, who's a current PhD student here.
Okay.
And he asked, do you see any difference between mission as virtuous influence and the classical use of catechism?
Classical view of...
Use of catechism.
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
difference between mission as virtuous influence and how catechism has classically been used in the Christian traditions.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say because I haven't really participated in catechism, and excuse my ignorance here, I know it's a set of things that you have to learn. So it's the teachings that they teach you and you have to learn it and know it. So if that's correct, then yes, I see a clear difference between the two. Because the virtuous influence is not about learning things and knowing them. It is about becoming something. So until whatever you are learning has made you into what you need to become, then you haven't got it.
That sounds like a useful conversation to be had, doesn't it? Who else has got a question? Jacob, do you want to come? Sorry. Do you want to come next?
Well, thank you. I'm from the U.S. and new to British black culture and trying to get a feel for it. And so, yeah, just thinking about ethical theory, and often MacIntyre's work is associated with kind of universal ethics and a more conservative tradition. And then in America, black ethics is often associated with subversive ethics. And universal and subversive don't have to be competitive, but often they are. So I guess, yeah, help me understand here in your context and this African diaspora community, how like those two forms of ethics are being, because often I see people from African American churches going the more subversive route. So it's interesting to hear you go the universal route. So yeah, just interested in your comments on that.
Well, if you are referring to McIntyre, then McIntyre is actually not a universalist because he actually works against that. Or he works within traditions. In the UK context, African diasporan communities, the ethics, especially in the Christian communities, Pentecostal Christians, the background or the foundation of their Christianity is based on holiness. So a lot of them, many of them will be strongly holiness, legal stuff people. And then later in the 80s, 90s, the idea of the Holy Spirit and the power that comes and everything is possible, that came to tame down the strictness in holiness. So instead of previously people thinking that if I live a holy life, I shun the wrong and do the right, the Lord will provide me, all those things. Now it's not like that anymore, but if the Holy Spirit comes, if the Holy Spirit upon me, he can do everything. So you see, these two positions immediately begin to show a direction of ethics, if you are getting me. So the idea of form yourself and be somebody, that is very difficult for another person to accuse or to blame when it comes to Christ. That one has gone down, and I have to admit that. Yeah. Our forebears, those we met as believers before us, they were really there, yes.
Hi, I'm coming from a slightly different perspective because I'm Caribbean second generation, okay. But I see a lot of similarities with what you've been saying, and I'm married a pastor of a holiness church, so I also see that, and from what I witnessed during my time there. I saw that, like, the differences quite often were to do with the fact that you were considered to be a youth until you were well into your 30s, which is a very different kind of system from in English churches. How would that kind of view be mitigated in order for people to come together? Because that, if you are, no matter what you believe, if the person in front of you is in their late 20s and you still consider them to be a youth, how can you get over that kind of thinking in order for people to come together?
Yeah, good question. I don't think that it is necessary for you not to see somebody as a youth before you accept them for who they are and allow them to contribute what they have on the table. That one is not necessary. So it is a Christian understanding that we all need, even with our children. So once somebody has received Christ into their lives, they have the Holy Spirit, which means the Holy Spirit has come with gifts into this person. So it doesn't matter how old they are, how young they are, we are expected to have some respect and acceptance of them, that they have something that we don't know which God has brought for us. So I don't think it's necessary to say that, oh, if you are 22, you are not youth, then I'll respect you. Now, when you speak, I'll listen. If you are 18, then you don't know. No, I don't think that's helpful. Yeah.
We've got a few more minutes. Julie, would you like to come and bring your question to us? Thank you.
Thank thank you very much for your lecture. Really interested in this idea about character formation and having that as the goal to which everybody aims. I was thinking, is there a danger that that might become a very individualistic thing? So every individual person wants to be formed into the likeness of Christ and aiming to be like Christ, but, could do that apart from the church. So, may feel that they don't actually need to attend church in order to pursue that within their life, rather than it being something that's part of the body.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that God expects us individually to try to form our character. That is why we are a community. So everyone in the community is supposed to contribute to the forming of the other person's character. That is my understanding of the scriptures. So we can't, in isolation, develop our character. And then when we come together as a church, we do mission. I struggle with that. Because even in the doing of the mission, the things that we are doing, which we are calling mission, should be things that are forming us into a particular type of people. And this, we have missed it a lot. Even as scholars, you are not part of that. As scholars, when we discuss these issues, we would try to think about how logical, how coherently we express these things. But we don't put enough stress on the outcome of all this. But the outcome is the whole thing. Is the whole thing. So the future Christianity that we are hoping to have, and I don't know how many people are going to take me serious, but if looking at missions again, and we all begin to look at mission in another way, maybe it will be different. And the world will see the difference, that we are not just talking about doing witnessing. As we do now, a lot of Christians will do witnessing. They'll go on trips, they'll go and do activities. But Jesus said, be witnesses. You see, so that challenge is there, but we all fear to face it because it's painful. It's painful to know that. So all this rush and doing it is good, but
I'm having trouble with the connection.
Don't have
Please
any
try
trouble.
again in a moment.
Shut up. Yeah, so that's my thought, though. That's my understanding of Christ, yeah.
We've time for one or two last questions before we just wrap up. Does anyone else want to? Jordan got a question coming in, or please bring it. We're keeping him fit by running up and down. Thank you.
Another one that's just come in from Ole Kanune. And he thanks you for the paper. He's observed that African diasporans fail to often make inroads in bringing the gospel to indigenous people in Britain, or Westerners more generally, and tend to form their own churches and thrive there alone. Would I be right to say that this will be the same in your church? If not, how do you see the diaspora making virtuous impact among indigenous communities in the UK?
Okay, so it is the same in my church, to start with. It is the same. And that is what actually instigated the study of the young people. Because some of us thought that the young people are more Western. If we aren't able to retain Westerners in the church, then there is a high tendency or probability that we won't be able to retain them. This is what instigated the whole study. So, yes, in my church also, we have sprinkles of Westerners. A lot of them, when they come, they don't stay because of these cultural things we are talking about. And so, now that the youth are bringing it up and it's becoming an issue, if we listen and humble ourselves enough and address it, then there is that possibility that we may be able to serve with the wider community in the future. But as it is now, when they come, they will leave.
Any other burning question you want to bring and ask? Okay, Mija, thank you.
Thanks, Lord, for the really thought-provoking paper. Just the final thing that you've just mentioned, and the final question was just really interesting. One of the questions that I guess, my own church is struggling as a South Korean diaspora church. Have you ever thought of actually shaping the church in a more of a multicultural or intercultural church? So, it is very much a Ghanaian Pentecostal church in the UK, but have you thought of the idea that the church becoming more intentionally intercultural church, which means then obviously your own very much a unique cultural identity need to be to some extent gone so that other cultures can come in? So have you thought about that?
Yes. In fact, my church has a system where every 6 months district ministers have to report on their members. And every 6 months you have to indicate how many non-Ghanaians you have in the church. Every 6 months. So it's an intentional thing, but there's one thing of being wanting something, and then there's another thing of creating an environment that makes that happen. It is the environment issue that we have, which we are dealing with. Because they reach out, people would come, but they'll stay for a while and then they disappear. Not that anyone has hurt them or anything, but the environment is not yet intercultural enough for them to want to remain there for long. So they disappear. And we are very much aware of that. That's what we are trying to work on to see how God will help us. Because both the leadership and everybody thinks that a church shouldn't be just monocultural. You can have some parishes that are monocultural, but the whole denomination cannot just be monocultural. And we are working on that.
Well, I think we'll draw it there. Thank you for your questions, for Lord, for coming today and sharing with us in chapel, and also for bringing this year's Drysdale Lecture. Lots of really interesting questions. It's great to hear as a practical theologian, to hear the reflection as a movement within your own tradition about critiquing and examining. And I'm sure the issues you've raised, as you've noted, are widespread among many churches. And I'm sure in our own congregations, there are underlying factors that you've tapped on tonight that we also can be looking at within our own existing congregations of whatever tradition and perhaps of whatever flavor and ethos and ethnic makeup. So we'd just like to say thank you for coming and being with us today. Thank you for your paper. You will be around. You will be here for a few minutes or so. Of course, when we have some coffee, you're all welcome to stay and to meet Lord if you haven't, and to maybe ask him the question privately you wanted to ask publicly, then feel free to do that. I'm sure he'll be very available to speak with you over coffee. So in closing, let's just show our appreciation for this lecture and for Lord's time with us, and we'll do that by a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Two publications that have been brought, and you'll find those in the foyer, some interesting books on this topic. And if you're able to stay, we'd love you to join for a cup of tea or a coffee within the cafe. Follow Robert, or wherever he goes, we will go. And please stay for a drink and refreshment. And thank you for your time and commitment to be here. We appreciate that also. So looking forward to what lies ahead. And we'll keep you informed about next year's Drysdale Lecture. And we're glad to add Lord to a long list of distinguished people. So thank you for coming once again.